Officer Daniels received a call that changed his perception of reality forever. A routine noise disturbance in an old, derelict part of town seemed ordinary enough. But as he arrived at the scene, an abandoned building with shattered windows stood in the pale glow of his patrol car's headlights. The neighborhood was unnaturally quiet, the air thick with a metallic scent he couldn't place. Pushing open the car door, Daniels adjusted his radio, the static crackling unnervingly as if protesting his presence. "Dispatch, this is Officer Daniels at 6th and Monroe. Arrived at location," he said, his voice steady but edged with a subconscious tremor. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the hum of insects seemed muted. Daniels stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. The old building loomed ahead, dark and imposing, its once white walls now stained and peeling. A shadow moved behind one of the windows, too quick to be just a trick of the light. "Who's there?" he shouted, the sound swallowed by the dense stillness. No response. He tightened his grip on his flashlight and moved forward, every step echoing like a drum beat in the void. Daniels approached the cracked door, its paint long since flaked away, revealing splintered wood beneath. He could feel the thump of his pulse as he reached for the handle, fingers tingling with anticipation. The radio at his side hissed again, a sudden, chilling voice breaking through the static. "Turn back, Daniels." He froze, eyes darting around the dimly lit street. The voice hadn't been familiar, and it certainly hadn't come from dispatch. His training told him to stay calm, to assess the situation before making any rash decisions, but instinct screamed at him to leave. Yet, curiosity and duty won out. The door creaked as it swung inward, revealing a hallway lined with warped floorboards and faded wallpaper. The scent of mildew mixed with that same metallic tang, more potent now. His flashlight illuminated the corridor, casting long, wavering shadows. A sudden clatter from upstairs sent a shiver racing down his spine. "Anyone here?" "This is the police," he called out, the echo of his voice dissipating into an unnatural silence. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, a faint whisper drifted down the stairs, unintelligible but persistent. Daniel's breath quickened as he mounted the first step, each creak beneath his weight louder than the last. The whispering grew clearer, turning into a chorus of voices all speaking over each other. His flashlight flickered once, twice, and then the beam steadied, revealing an old picture frame on the wall. Inside was a photograph of a group of officers, smiling and proud, their uniforms crisp. Daniels squinted, feeling the hair on the back of his neck rise. The man in the center looked just like him. Daniels took a step back, eyes locked on the photograph as a bead of sweat trailed down his temple. His hands trembled, the flashlight shaking enough to cast erratic shadows that danced across the peeling wallpaper. The whispers seemed to intensify, their tone shifting from urgent to accusatory. He rubbed his eyes, willing the apparition away, but when he looked again, the photograph was still there, unaltered except for one thing. The smile on the lookalike's face had twisted into a grimace. A sudden noise jolted him out of his stunned state, a sharp thud followed by hurried footsteps overhead. He swung the flashlight upward, its beam barely illuminating the ceiling. He weighed his options: leave now and possibly risk his reputation, or go up and face whatever was lurking in the abandoned house. "Dispatch, this is Officer Daniels. I need backup at 6th and Monroe. Possible break-in," he said, but the radio only hissed in reply, as if mocking his request. The air thickened, and Daniels struggled to catch his breath. The metallic scent was now a suffocating cloud. With each step he took up the staircase, the whispers grew louder, morphing into cries, moans, and gasps. Reaching the landing, he found a long corridor with doors lining each side, most of them cracked open. A cold draft brushed past him, and he could swear he saw movement at the end of the hallway. "Show yourself," he shouted, voice breaking at the end. The response was silence, thick, palpable silence. He approached the nearest room and pushed the door open with his foot. The hinges groaned as if protesting, revealing a child's bedroom frozen in time. Dust-covered toys were scattered across the floor, and the bed was neatly made, untouched for years. The sight was almost comforting until he noticed a set of small, dirty footprints leading to the closet. He swallowed hard, the room spinning slightly as he reached for the closet door handle. The whispers seemed to converge, a single voice speaking directly into his ear. "You shouldn't have come." Daniel's hand froze on the closet handle as the voice whispered into his ear. The room, once stale and stagnant, now pulsed with an energy that prickled his skin and sent shivers down his spine. His breathing came in shallow, rapid gasps, the walls seeming to close in. He couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on him, watching with malicious intent. "Get a grip, Daniels," he muttered to himself, but his voice sounded foreign and hollow in the room. The dusty air felt thicker, almost tactile as it pressed against him. With one swift motion, he yanked open the closet door, expecting an explosion of movement, a shadow darting forward, or even a mundane pile of forgotten clothes. Instead, there was nothing but darkness, a black so complete it seemed to absorb the flashlight's beam. But as he squinted, something shifted. A glimmer of white emerged, forming a handprint that glowed faintly against the black void. Daniel stumbled back, the print growing brighter as if it acknowledged his presence. "Why are you here?" The voice was clear this time, a woman's voice, hollow and full of sorrow. He whipped around, aiming his flashlight at the source, only to see the empty room behind him. His radio crackled to life, the familiar voice of dispatch cutting through the tension. "Daniels, come in. Are you there?" Relief flooded him for a split second, but it quickly evaporated when the voice on the radio shifted, mimicking his own. "Daniels, are you there?" The imitation was flawless, the tone dripping with mockery. Daniels backed into the hallway, muscles tensed as he scanned his surroundings. The whispers resumed, now a chorus, chanting his name over and over. Footsteps echoed again, this time from the far end of the hallway. A shadow appeared, distorted and elongated, shambling toward him. It moved like a marionette with broken strings, its joints bending at unnatural angles. The flashlight flickered, and darkness swallowed the hallway in intervals. Each blink brought the figure closer, the glint of eyes reflecting the sparse light with an almost hungry gleam. Daniels turned on his heel and bolted down the stairs, taking them two at a time. The house seemed to resist him, the air thickening and a low, rumbling sound vibrating the walls. He burst through the front door, falling onto the cracked pavement outside. The sudden rush of night air hit him, sharp and cold. Scrambling to his feet, he turned to see the shadow standing in the doorway, a grin stretching impossibly wide across its face before it receded into the darkness. Gasping, Daniel stumbled to his patrol car, hands fumbling for the keys. He slid into the driver's seat, locking the doors and starting the engine. The headlights cast a cone of light over the house, which now appeared still and lifeless, as though mocking him with its silence. He pressed the radio button, voice trembling. "Dispatch, this is Daniels. I need immediate backup at my location. Possible intruder and something else." Static responded, then a burst of laughter, not human, but low and guttural, seeping into his bones. He dropped the radio and looked at the dashboard. Every light on it blinked, the car's engine sputtering and shaking. Suddenly a knock at the window. He jumped so hard that the seat creaked beneath him. Outside was an old woman, frail and dressed in clothes decades out of fashion. Her face was pale, eyes hollow but pleading. "Help us," she mouthed before vanishing into thin air, leaving a frosted handprint on the glass. Daniel stared in disbelief, the cold imprint spreading a chill through the air inside the car. The whispers in the radio resumed, merging with the chorus from inside the house. "You shouldn't have come." This time, it wasn't just a warning. It was a promise. The laughter echoed in the silence, wrapping around Daniels like chains. He shivered, his heartbeat a relentless drum in his ears. Suddenly, the car's radio sputtered to life, but instead of the familiar voice of dispatch, It emitted a series of garbled sounds, like dozens of voices whispering over each other. He strained to make sense of it, and a single phrase stood out clearly: "Not done yet." The headlights flickered, and for a moment, the house seemed to ripple, as though it were breathing. Daniels blinked, hoping he was hallucinating, but when he opened his eyes, the shadowy figure from before stood at the window, eyes gleaming with a feral intensity. He slammed the car into reverse, tires screeching against the cracked pavement as he sped backward. The house grew smaller in the rearview mirror, but the whispers didn't fade. They only seemed to grow louder. He reached the main road and took a hard right, nearly losing control as he skidded onto the pavement. The streetlights were a blur as he drove, their warm glow providing momentary comfort. But in between the flashes of light, darkness seemed to stretch, filled with ghostly shapes that watched him pass. His phone buzzed on the dashboard, the screen lighting up with an unknown number. Against his better judgment, he swiped to answer. "Hello?" His voice cracked. There was no response at first, only the sound of breathing. Then that same sorrowful woman's voice came through. "They won't let you go, Daniels, not until you see." The line went dead, and Daniels' blood ran cold. He realized he wasn't heading to the station anymore. Somehow, without noticing, he had looped back around. The street sign at the intersection read 6th and Monroe. The house loomed ahead, waiting for him, silent and patient. Daniels's fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly they ached. Panic clawed at him, his rational mind battling against the surreal horror unfolding. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed down on him. He turned off the engine, heart thudding like a trapped bird, and stared at the house. It looked the same as before, dark, decrepit, and somehow aware of his presence. The air outside felt heavier as he stepped out, each movement slow and deliberate. He needed to know what this was, why the house had called him back. His boots crunched on the gravel as he approached the front steps, the door ajar as though inviting him inside. The moment he crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him. The room plunged into darkness, but this time, Daniels wasn't alone. Shadows detached themselves from the walls, humanoid shapes with blank, staring eyes. One by one, they whispered his name, their voices overlapping in a ghostly chorus. In the center of the room stood the woman from the photograph, eyes filled with grief. She raised an arm and pointed to the closet where he had seen the handprint. "You must see," she said, her voice trembling with urgency. A compulsion took over, and Daniels moved as though in a trance. He opened the closet door, revealing a staircase spiraling downward into pitch black. The metallic scent was suffocating now, but he had no choice. The shadows crowded around, guiding him into the unknown, their whispers filling his ears as the world above faded. When the last of the light disappeared, Daniels realized that the whispers were right. He wasn't done yet, and he would never be. Jeff Walters had been a long-haul trucker for over a decade, a veteran of countless overnight drives and lonely highways. He thought he'd seen it all: wild animals darting in front of his truck, hitchhikers with shadowed eyes, and the vast, suffocating emptiness of the desert under a full moon. But none of that had prepared him for the stretch of road known only to locals as the Haunting Mile. He first heard the stories while sitting in a dingy truck stop diner just outside of Silver Creek, a forgotten town tucked between rolling hills and the endless expanse of road. Other truckers spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting to the windows as though expecting something to peer back from the darkness beyond. "They say that mile is cursed," muttered Hank, an older driver with a scruffy beard and a voice like gravel. "People who drive through see things that follow them home." Jeff had chuckled at the time, brushing it off as trucker folklore meant to spook the newcomers. But that was before he found himself assigned a route that took him right through the Haunting Mile on Halloween night. As he approached the mile marker, the sky seemed to darken unnaturally, a cloudless night sky swallowing the moon's glow. The radio crackled, unable to hold a station, sputtering out half-heard words and a faint static that clawed at his nerves. He adjusted his grip on the wheel, muscles tensing as the temperature inside the cab plummeted. A figure appeared up ahead, standing in the middle of the road. Jeff slammed the brakes, tires squealing as the truck skidded to a stop. The headlights illuminated a woman in a tattered white dress, her hair matted and face obscured by shadow. She didn't move, didn't flinch as the massive vehicle halted mere feet from where she stood. "Hey, are you okay?" Jeff called, his voice unsteady as he peered through the windshield. But the woman remained still, head tilted slightly as if listening. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped down from the cab, the cold air biting at his skin as he approached cautiously. When he reached her, the beam of light fell on empty space. The road was deserted, stretching out silently before him. Jeff's pulse quickened. He spun around, scanning the darkness, only to find his truck sitting alone, headlights casting long, eerie shadows. Jeff's breath came in shallow gasps as he climbed back into the cab, locking the doors with shaking hands. The empty road ahead seemed to stretch forever, cloaked in darkness that the truck's lights could only barely penetrate. He reached for the ignition, fingers trembling, and turned the key. The engine roared to life, but the sense of dread clung to him like a second skin. He glanced in the side mirror and nearly yelped when he saw a flash of white dart across the edge of the headlights. His heart slammed in his chest, the memory of the woman in the road replaying in his mind. He took a deep breath and shifted into gear, pushing down on the accelerator to get out of the haunting mile as quickly as possible. The radio crackled again, this time with a low murmur, as though a crowd of people were whispering in unison. He reached to turn it off, but froze when a voice came through clearly, chilling him to the bone. "Jeff, you can't leave." The truck shuddered, and for a moment, he swore he felt hands pressing against the side of the cab, as if trying to push it off the road. Panic gripped him, and he floored the gas pedal, the tires spinning on the asphalt before catching hold. The truck surged forward, breaking the grasp of whatever unseen force clung to it. He kept his eyes locked on the road ahead, refusing to look into the mirrors, where shadows seemed to shift and dance. The whispers grew louder, filling the cab, surrounding him. It was as if a dozen people sat behind him, their breath warm against the back of his neck. Jeff's knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel, sweat trickling down his temple despite the cold. Suddenly, a figure darted into the road from the side. He braced for impact, slamming the brakes again, but the figure passed through the headlights and vanished. The truck skidded to a halt, the momentum throwing Jeff forward against the seatbelt. The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Jeff sat frozen, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He glanced out the window, heart thudding as he searched the darkness. The only sound was the soft rumble of the engine and his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. Jeff shifted back into gear, desperate to put as much distance between himself and the haunting mile as possible. The road ahead seemed endless, but he pushed the truck faster, willing himself to ignore the sensation of being watched. He didn't see the reflection in the mirror at first, a shadowy silhouette sitting in the passenger seat. It was only when the headlights illuminated an old road sign that read, "Welcome to Silver Creek," that he glanced over and saw her. The woman from the road sat next to him, her eyes wide and glassy, mouth partially open as though about to speak. Jeff's scream caught in his throat and he swerved, the truck veering dangerously close to the edge of the road. In a heartbeat, she was gone. The passenger seat was empty, save for the indentation as if someone had been sitting there moments before. Jeff's pulse raced and he swallowed hard, muscles tensed as he tried to focus on driving. "Don't look back." The voice was no longer on the radio. It was inside the cab, as clear as if someone whispered directly into his ear. Jeff's vision blurred with panic and the truck rumbled dangerously close to the shoulder of the road before he managed to steady it. His breath came in short, jagged gasps as he stared at the empty seat beside him. It wasn't just his imagination. He could still feel the chill of her presence lingering in the cab, like a cold breath against his skin. He blinked, focusing on the road. He needed to get to Silver Creek and find a place to stop, to collect his thoughts and shake off whatever had attached itself to him on that cursed mile. The headlights cut through the darkness, and the desolate road seemed to stretch into infinity, winding through dense trees that loomed like silent sentinels. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life once more. This time it wasn't static or whispers, it was the sound of a woman sobbing. The sound filled the cab, raw and desperate, as though she was sitting right beside him. Jeff's hand darted to the radio dial, but no matter how he twisted it, the sobbing only grew louder. It pierced his ears, resonating in his chest, each sob a plea that seemed to sink into his bones. "Help me." The voice broke through, quiet and fragmented. "Please. They won't let me rest." Jeff's fingers slipped off the dial, a chill racing down his spine. The voice was familiar now. It was the same voice he'd heard whispered from the darkness of the haunting mile. Before he could process it, the road twisted and a sudden shape appeared in the beam of his headlights. He stomped on the brakes, tires shrieking against the asphalt as the truck skidded to a halt. His heart nearly burst from his chest when he realized it was a dilapidated road sign, tilted and overgrown, pointing to a long abandoned house just off the road. "You must go back." The voice in the cab was close, as if spoken into his ear. Jeff didn't remember making the decision to step out of the truck, but suddenly the night air hit his face cold and electric. The sobs had stopped, replaced by an unnatural silence. Ahead of him, the old house loomed, half swallowed by the forest and time. Its windows were black voids, and the front door creaked slightly as it moved in the wind, like a beckoning gesture. He took a step forward, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, to get in the truck, and leave this place forever. But something else, a deeper compulsion, pushed him on. The air grew colder with each step, heavy with the metallic taste of fear. The creak of the porch under his weight was loud, and the door, weathered and splintered, swung open without him touching it. Inside, the room was filled with relics of the past. Faded photographs, dusty furniture, and a shattered mirror that seemed to weep with cracks. The air was thick with the scent of damp and decay, and the shadows seemed to shift as if aware of his presence. At the far end of the room, a staircase spiraled up into the dark, and on the first step lay a single muddy footprint. He knew whose it was before he even approached. His heart clenched as the voice returned, soft and distant. "Help me find peace, Jeff." Jeff's feet carried him up the stairs before he could stop himself. Each step creaked under his weight, the house itself seeming to sigh around him. He reached the top and found a narrow hallway lined with closed doors. One door at the end was slightly ajar, a faint glow emanating from inside. He approached it, hands trembling, and pushed it open. Inside, the room was empty except for an old rocking chair that moved gently back and forth. On the floor lay an old, yellowed photograph of a woman in a white dress, her face the same as the spectral figure he'd seen on the road. A sudden realization washed over him as he recognized the setting in the photograph. This very house. He pieced it together in a rush. She had died here, lost to the violence of the past, and her spirit had remained trapped, calling out to those who passed through the haunting mile. The whispers, the sobs, they were all cries for help, for release. Jeff knelt and whispered, "You can rest now." The air shifted, the oppressive weight lifting as the chair stopped moving. A soft, grateful sigh echoed around him, and a light breeze swept through the room, carrying with it the scent of lilies. When Jeff stood, the glow had faded, and the house felt empty, not haunted, but serene. He made his way back to the truck, the sky beginning to lighten with the first hint of dawn. The road that had once terrified him now seemed calm, and the voice that had haunted him whispered a final, gentle farewell. "Thank you." It was a foggy evening when Ben, a seasoned trucker, first encountered something he couldn't explain. He had just left a small, sleepy town after finishing a delivery and was on his way to the next drop-off point when the fog rolled in, thick and impenetrable. The headlights of his rig barely cut through the mist, casting eerie shadows on the twisted road ahead. The deep growl of the engine was the only sound he could hear over the thrum of the tires on the wet asphalt. Ben had driven this stretch of road countless times before. It was one of those quiet routes, isolated, but familiar. At least that's how he had always thought of it. It was a narrow, winding road that cut through a dense forest, and the eerie fog that had suddenly descended only added to the sense of isolation. As the minutes passed, the fog seemed to grow thicker, almost as if it was alive, wrapping around the truck in a suffocating embrace. Ben squinted through the windshield, trying to make out the road ahead. He had just started to slow down when he saw something that made his heart skip a beat. Out of nowhere, a shadow appeared on the edge of the road. It was tall, too tall to be a man, and it seemed to emerge from the very mist itself, like something that had always been there, waiting. Ben's first instinct was to slow down, but his curiosity got the better of him. He gripped the steering wheel tightly and leaned forward, trying to make sense of the figure that was now standing motionless in the fog. The shadow didn't move. It didn't seem to breathe. And then, just as Ben thought about driving past, something else caught his eye. In the rearview mirror, he saw a faint, flickering light. It was far behind him, but it was moving quickly, faster than any vehicle should have been able to go on this road. Ben's gut twisted in unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something that he couldn't put his finger on. The shadow in the mist seemed to watch him as he drove past, and the light behind him continued to follow. The eerie sensation grew stronger, like he wasn't alone. He glanced over his shoulder again, but saw nothing in the mirror. Just fog. Still, the sensation lingered, growing more intense with each passing mile. Ben couldn't explain it, but it was as if someone, or something, was in the truck with him. As Ben continued down the foggy road, the light in the rearview mirror grew closer, despite the fact that he was driving at a steady 50 miles per hour. It wasn't the headlights of another vehicle, that much was clear. The light had a strange, pulsating quality to it, flickering like a candle that was struggling to stay lit in the wind. His breath grew shallow, the tension in his chest increasing. His instinct screamed at him to stop and check, to make sure he wasn't imagining things. But he couldn't bring himself to pull over. He just wanted to get through this stretch of road and be done with it. The eerie light was now so close that it seemed to be right on top of him, and Ben could feel his heart racing. He glanced at the dashboard clock, just 2 more miles until he reached the next turnoff, a small rest stop where he could park and figure out what was going on. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished. Ben's eyes widened. He checked the mirror again, this time with frantic urgency, but there was nothing. No flickering light, just the thick, swirling fog. His hand tightened on the wheel as he tried to steady his breathing. He had been driving for years, and this was the first time he had ever felt so unnerved by something so simple. But the feeling of being watched never left him. A cold chill ran down his spine. He tried to dismiss it as fatigue, as his mind playing tricks on him, but the fear lingered, creeping into every corner of his mind. What the hell had he just seen? He wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Ben pulled into the rest stop, a small, secluded area tucked away by the side of the road. It was still foggy, but it was quieter here, and he hoped that getting out of the truck would help him clear his head. He killed the engine and sat in the silence for a moment, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over him like a heavy blanket. The truck door creaked open as he stepped out into the cool air, his boots crunching against the gravel as he made his way to the small restroom nearby. He needed to use the facilities and get a drink of water. He couldn't focus until he had a moment to calm himself down. But as he walked past the back of the truck, something made him stop. There, in the passenger seat of his rig, was a figure. At first he thought it was a trick of the fog or the shadows, but the figure was real. He could see the faint outline of a person sitting there, staring straight ahead. Ben froze, his heart thudding in his chest. There shouldn't have been anyone in the truck. He rushed back to the driver's side door and yanked it open, expecting to find some homeless person or hitchhiker who had somehow snuck inside. But when he looked inside, the seat was empty. His breath caught in his throat as he checked the back of the truck, the cab, the sleeper berth. Nothing. There was no one there. Ben stood there for a moment, his pulse racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had he imagined it? Had the stress of the road gotten to him? He wasn't sure, but something told him that he wasn't alone. The rest stop was quiet, almost too quiet. The fog had thickened again, and the lights of the truck stop flickered faintly in the distance. Ben sat on the edge of his rig, trying to shake off the fear that had gripped him. He lit a cigarette, watching the smoke curl into the damp air. It wasn't long before he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. At first he thought it was just the wind, but then the sound became more distinct. Someone was walking toward him. Ben stood up slowly, his hand instinctively reaching for the truck's door handle. He turned toward the sound of the footsteps, and there, just at the edge of the fog, was a figure. It was a man, his face obscured by the mist, his clothes ragged and worn. The man took another step forward, and Ben's stomach churned. Something about him felt off, like he was too still, too quiet. The man was walking in perfect, deliberate strides, but there was no sound to his steps, no crunch of gravel beneath his boots. Ben opened his mouth to ask if the man needed help, but the words caught in his throat. The man was close enough now for Ben to see his eyes. Empty, hollow, like they had been drained of life. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The air grew colder, and the mist seemed to close in tighter around them. The man's lips curled into a smile that wasn't quite human, and then, just as quickly as he had appeared, the figure vanished into the fog. Ben stood there for a long time, the cigarette burning out in his hand, his mind racing to comprehend what had just happened. The rest of the night passed in a haze of confusion. Ben couldn't stop thinking about the figure, the vanishing passenger, and the strange feeling of being watched. He had to get back on the road. The longer he stayed at that stop, the more paranoid he became. The fog was still thick as he pulled back onto the highway, the hum of the engine filling the cab. The road stretched on, and Ben tried to focus on the task at hand. The miles ticked by slowly, but the feeling of unease never left him. Every flicker of the headlights, every shadow on the side of the road made his skin crawl. And then, just as he thought he was safe, just as he thought he had outrun whatever had haunted him that night, the radio crackled to life. "Where are you going, Ben?" The voice was low, almost a whisper, a voice that wasn't his own, but one that seemed to come from the very walls of the truck. Ben's hands gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He glanced around the cab, but there was no one there. The truck was empty. He heard the sound of footsteps behind him, faint but unmistakable. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror. And there, sitting in the passenger seat, was the same figure, the same man with hollow eyes, watching him in the reflection. Ben screamed. Ben's heart hammered in his chest as his vision blurred, and the figure in the mirror seemed to grow taller, its hollow eyes never leaving his. He slammed his foot on the gas pedal, pushing the truck to its limits, but the mist seemed to close in tighter, making it difficult to see. The road was endless, a never-ending stretch that spiraled deeper into the unknown. Ben was no longer in control, not of the truck, not of his sanity. Every instinct he had screamed at him to pull over to stop, but he couldn't. The figure was always there, watching him. He glanced in the rearview mirror again. The figure hadn't moved, but the air in the cab had changed. The temperature had dropped significantly, his breath coming out in short, visible bursts. The road ahead was shrouded in fog, but the headlights no longer seemed to cut through it. He could barely make out the white lines on the side of the road, and every turn felt as though he was driving deeper into a void. Time had lost all meaning. The voice came again, low and distorted, like it was coming from all around him. "Where are you going, Ben?" "There's nowhere to run." The voice sounded familiar but distorted, almost like a mockery of the radio static that occasionally filled the dead air of long, lonely roads. He couldn't take it any longer. His hands, clammy with sweat, gripped the wheel tighter as he floored the accelerator, hoping to outrun whatever had attached itself to him. But no matter how fast he went, the fog remained thick, the shadow in the passenger seat ever present, and the voice grew louder. He could feel his sanity slipping away, the weight of the dread crushing him like a suffocating force. The truck seemed to be pulling him deeper into the fog, into an endless loop. His eyes darted from the rearview mirror to the empty road ahead, and that's when he saw it. The road ahead had split into two paths, one dark and narrow, the other barely visible, leading to a forest. The figure in the passenger seat began to lean forward, its hollow eyes fixed on him, its lips curling into an eerie grin that stretched unnaturally wide. "You're not going anywhere, Ben," the voice whispered, its tone mocking, almost laughing. The truck started to slow, as if it had a mind of its own, and no matter how much Ben tried to press the gas pedal, it wouldn't budge. Panic set in, his breath coming in short gasps. He grabbed the wheel, pulling it violently to the right, but the truck seemed to move on its own. He tried again, harder this time, but it felt like something was holding him in place. And then, just like that, the fog cleared. The road stretched out before him, empty and quiet. There was no figure, no voice, just the sound of the truck's engine rumbling steadily. He glanced to his right. The passenger seat was empty. Ben blinked, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. His hands were shaking as he turned off the engine and stepped out of the truck, the cool night air hitting his face. The fog had lifted and he was parked on the side of an unfamiliar road. The world around him was eerily still, as if nothing had ever happened. Confused and disoriented, Ben stumbled away from the truck, his legs weak beneath him. He looked around. There was no one. Nothing. Just the road. His breath was ragged, his mind racing to understand what had just unfolded. Was it a hallucination? A trick of his exhausted mind? Or had he truly encountered something beyond the realm of the living? As he stood there, trying to make sense of it all, a sound broke the silence. A car engine. Low and distant, growing louder. Ben's heart stopped in his chest as he turned, hoping, praying that it was just another driver passing by. But as the car came into view, he saw it. The figure in the passenger seat. Its hollow eyes stared back at him from the moving vehicle. The trucker's gut twisted in terror, his body frozen, his mind racing. The car slowed down as it approached him, and Ben could see the figure's silhouette more clearly now. It was grinning, its lips stretching unnaturally wide, its face gaunt and pale. The vehicle came to a stop in front of him, the door creaking open slowly. Ben didn't know what to do. He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The fog, now thick again, rolled in from the surrounding woods, enveloping everything in its cold embrace. The figure's smile deepened and a chill ran down Ben's spine. "You can't outrun this road," the figure whispered from the shadows. Its voice was the same distorted whisper Ben had heard earlier, the one that had followed him all the way down that lonely stretch of highway. Ben's hands trembled as he took a step back, but the figure continued to move closer. It was as if the fog itself was alive, feeding on the fear that radiated from him. The more he struggled, the tighter the grip of terror became, suffocating him. "Where are you going, Ben?" "You've already reached your destination," the figure chuckled, its voice dripping with malice. The trucker couldn't breathe. He was trapped. And before he could even react, the figure was there, standing right in front of him, its hollow eyes staring into his very soul. The fog closed in, and Ben vanished into the night. Jason had been a trucker for over 15 years, a seasoned veteran of long-haul routes winding through the darkest corners of the country. He'd driven countless miles on lonely roads, faced harsh weather, and weathered the eeriest of nights. But nothing had prepared him for the terror he would face one fateful evening. It was a late October night, the moon hanging low in the sky, casting pale light over the barren landscape. Jason had just finished a long delivery across the state and was heading home. He had taken the usual route, a quiet stretch of highway that passed through desolate forests and long-abandoned towns. It was the kind of road that no one drove down unless they absolutely had to, a place that was as empty as it was lonely. Jason liked this stretch of road. It was quiet, peaceful even. But that night, something felt different. There was a chill in the air that seemed to seep into his bones, despite the truck's heater being on full blast. The truck's headlights illuminated the endless stretch of asphalt, but it felt like they barely made a dent in the thick darkness that surrounded him. As he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was well past midnight. He had another hour or so before he reached the next town, where he could rest for the night. The miles stretched out in front of him like an endless void, but Jason had driven through worse. The road was straight, with little to no traffic, and he had become used to the monotony. But then, as he passed a bend in the road, he saw something that stopped him cold. A figure. At first it was just a shadow, barely visible in the corner of his eye, but as he drew closer, it became clear. A person, standing by the side of the road. Jason slowed the truck, his eyes narrowing in the dim light. The figure was tall, dressed in dark clothes, and was just standing there, motionless, staring at him. The unsettling thing was that there was no movement, no waving for help, no sign of distress, just standing there, silent, unblinking. Jason's heart skipped a beat. He had driven this road countless times and had never seen anyone out here. He considered stopping, but a gut feeling told him not to. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, his instincts warning him that something was wrong. As the truck passed by, Jason stole one last glance at the figure. That's when he saw it. The figure's face. It was pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce right through him. Jason's blood ran cold. It wasn't just the face that terrified him. It was the fact that the figure hadn't moved at all, not even a twitch. His mind raced. Could it be someone in need of help? But then, why wasn't the person waving or even moving? Something wasn't right. Jason sped up, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. The eerie figure seemed to vanish into the night, swallowed by the darkness as the truck's headlights moved farther down the road. He breathed a sigh of relief, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in his chest. But the unease didn't go away. For the next few miles, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The eerie silence around him had grown even more pronounced, and the feeling of being alone on this stretch of road, of being utterly isolated, was almost unbearable. Every rustling sound outside the truck, every creak of the engine made him jump. The dark woods lining the road seemed to close in on him, the trees looking like black shadows that pressed against the road, their gnarled branches stretching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. Jason kept his eyes on the road ahead, but his thoughts kept returning to the figure. Who was that person? Why had they been standing there, so still, so motionless? Had he imagined it? But he hadn't imagined the face, the eyes, those hollow eyes that seemed to look right through him. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following him, but the road behind him was empty, nothing but darkness. He shook his head, trying to calm his nerves. As the truck continued down the empty highway, Jason's unease grew. He hadn't seen any other vehicles for hours, and now the silence seemed to be pressing in on him from all sides. He turned the volume up on the radio, hoping that the familiar noise would calm his nerves. But even the static-filled radio broadcasts seemed to amplify the oppressive silence around him. And then it happened again. Out of the corner of his eye, Jason saw a shadow on the side of the road. His heart skipped. It was impossible. He had just passed this stretch. But there it was, standing in the same position as before. The figure, just standing there motionless, its eyes locked on him. Jason's breath caught in his throat, and his hands tightened on the wheel. This time he wasn't imagining it. He could see the figure clearly, even though the headlights barely illuminated the area. It wasn't a trick of the light. The figure was real, and it was waiting for him. He couldn't stop now. His instinct screamed at him to drive faster, to get away. He floored the gas pedal, the truck's engine roaring as he pushed the vehicle forward, desperately trying to put distance between himself and the figure. But no matter how fast he went, the figure seemed to stay in his rearview mirror, always there, watching him. Jason's pulse quickened, his grip on the wheel becoming almost painful. The figure was following him. Jason couldn't understand it. He had driven for miles, but no matter how much ground he covered, the figure remained behind him, always in the distance, always just outside of his field of vision. His eyes darted to the mirror, but the figure wasn't there anymore. It had vanished. Had it? Jason's mind raced as he tried to rationalize what was happening. He was exhausted, had been on the road for hours, and the stress of the long haul was starting to take its toll. Maybe it was just fatigue messing with his mind. But then, a loud bang from the truck's rear axles startled him. He swerved, the tires screeching as the truck veered off course, barely maintaining control. The brakes squealed in protest as Jason fought to keep the vehicle on the road. What the hell was that? His heart raced as he slowed the truck down, pulling over to the side of the road. He didn't know what was happening, but it wasn't normal. There was no sound now, no movement, just the eerie silence of the dark highway. Jason sat there for a long moment, his hand still gripping the wheel, his breath shallow. He turned off the engine and stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching against the gravel as he walked to the back to inspect the vehicle. His mind was foggy, but there was a nagging feeling that something wasn't right. He froze when he saw it. A pair of pale footprints were imprinted in the gravel right behind the truck, leading into the woods. Jason's stomach churned. He followed the footprints into the woods, the trees looming over him like silent witnesses to whatever horror had unfolded. The moon was barely visible through the thick canopy of branches, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth. The further Jason walked, the stronger the feeling of dread became. The footprints seemed to fade as he ventured deeper, but he knew they had led him here. He had to find out what was going on, why he was being haunted by that figure. He stumbled upon an old abandoned cabin hidden in the thick brush. The door was ajar, and the faintest glimmer of light flickered from within, casting eerie shadows on the ground. Jason's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't help himself. He approached the door slowly, his body trembling with fear. He had to know the truth. As he stepped inside, the faint smell of decay hit him, and his eyes adjusted to the dim light. The room was barren, except for a dusty old chair in the corner facing a cracked mirror. And in the mirror, Jason saw himself. But not exactly. The reflection in the mirror didn't match his movements. It smiled. It wasn't him anymore. It was a hollow-eyed figure standing there waiting for him. Jason's breath caught in his throat. The figure in the mirror turned its head slowly, its hollow eyes locking onto his with a chilling intensity. "Where are you going, Jason?" The voice was a whisper, a cold, distorted echo that seemed to come from everywhere. "There's nowhere to run." The door behind him slammed shut, and the room was plunged into darkness. The air around him grew thick with a palpable presence, suffocating him as the figure in the mirror slowly stepped out of its reflection. Jason turned and ran, his mind blank with terror, his footsteps echoing through the empty cabin as the figure followed. The trees outside seemed to close in on him, and the road, the truck, everything vanished. The search for Jason lasted weeks, but no trace of him was ever found. The only clue was his truck, abandoned on the side of the highway, still running. But the road was never the same again. Drivers who passed through that stretch of highway began to report strange sightings, figures standing on the side of the road, motionless, their eyes hollow and empty. And sometimes they would hear the soft, whispering voice of Jason calling out in the distance. But the trucker's name was never spoken aloud again. The highway, it seemed, had claimed its next victim. It was a cold, foggy evening when Officer Lydia Miller's shift began. The clock on the wall at the small police station struck 9 p.m., signaling the start of another long, uneventful night. The town was quiet, nestled away in the mountains where only a few hundred residents lived. Crime was rare and the station's phone hardly ever rang. But tonight, there was something different in the air. Lydia had been working at the station for nearly 5 years, and she had become accustomed to the stillness of the night shift. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off as she sat behind the desk, filling out reports. There was an unexplainable tension, a strange quiet that seemed to hang in the air. The only sound was the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Then the phone rang. Lydia jumped, her hand freezing mid-typing. The ringing broke the silence like a loud clap of thunder. She glanced at the phone, unsure whether she should answer. It was unusual for anyone to call this late at night, especially on such a quiet evening. The phone rang again, and she quickly reached for the receiver. Police Department, Officer Miller speaking. The voice on the other end was distorted, as if the person was speaking from a great distance or through some sort of static. "Help! Help me!" The voice was faint, almost pleading. Lydia's heart skipped a beat. "Who is this?" she asked, leaning forward in her seat. "What's going on?" The line crackled again, and for a moment there was nothing but static. Then the voice returned, this time clearer but more frantic. "They're coming. They're watching. Please, don't let them find me." Lydia's blood ran cold. The words were chilling, and her gut told her that this was no ordinary call. The person on the other end sounded terrified, like they were in immediate danger. Before Lydia could respond, the line went dead. She stared at the phone for a long moment, her mind racing. Who was that? And what did they mean by they? The phone call seemed to echo in her ears as the room grew colder. She had to do something. She couldn't just ignore it. Lydia grabbed the police radio and called out to her partner, Officer James Reynolds, who was patrolling the streets that night. "James, did you hear anything strange on the radio? Any reports of suspicious activity?" There was a brief pause before James responded, his voice calm but with a hint of concern. "No, nothing unusual. Why? You okay?" Lydia hesitated, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "I just got a strange call. Someone was begging for help. They said they're coming." She paused. "I think I need to go check this out. It didn't sound like a prank. I'm going to drive out to the woods near the old cabin." James didn't hesitate. "I'll meet you there." With that, Lydia grabbed her flashlight and a few essentials, then headed out into the thick fog that had rolled in, shrouding the town in an eerie silence. The fog was so thick that she could barely see a few feet in front of her. She quickly made her way to her patrol car, her mind racing with the unsettling feeling that something terrible was waiting for her. Lydia drove down the winding road that led out of town, her headlights cutting through the dense fog. The woods surrounding the road were thick, the trees towering like dark giants. The path she was following was one she knew well, though she hadn't traveled this stretch in years. The cabin was situated on an isolated hill, far from any homes, and had been abandoned for decades. The fog grew denser the further she drove, and Lydia found herself gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her eyes darted nervously to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, or someone, there. But the road was empty. As she turned off the main road and onto the narrow dirt path that led to the cabin, she felt a chill run down her spine. It was as though the air had suddenly become heavier, thick with an unexplainable dread. The tires of her car crunched on the gravel as she slowly made her way up the hill. The cabin appeared out of the mist like something out of a nightmare. It was dark, dilapidated, and covered in vines, its wooden frame decaying from years of neglect. The front door hung crookedly on its hinges and the windows were shattered, covered with years of grime and dirt. The entire place exuded an unsettling atmosphere, as though it had been abandoned for a reason. Lydia parked the car a few yards away and stepped out, her flashlight in hand. Her breath formed in the cold air as she slowly walked toward the cabin. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, and every instinct was screaming at her to turn back, to leave this place behind. But she couldn't. Someone had called for help, and she had to find out who. The beam of her flashlight flickered as she reached the cabin's front door, casting long shadows across the porch. She hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open. The wood creaked loudly, the sound echoing in the otherwise silent night. As she stepped inside, she felt an overwhelming sense of unease wash over her. The air inside was thick with dust and mildew, and the room was completely dark except for the light of her flashlight. She scanned the room, taking in the remnants of what had once been a living space. Broken furniture, old, rotting bookshelves, and discarded clothing were scattered across the floor. It looked as though no one had been here in years. Suddenly, a noise behind her caused her to freeze. A soft shuffle, like footsteps. Lydia spun around, shining her flashlight toward the source of the noise. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure, a man. He was tall and thin, dressed in ragged clothing, his face obscured by the shadows. Lydia's heart skipped a beat. "Who are you?" she called out, her voice steady despite the terror rising in her chest. The figure didn't answer. Instead, he took a step forward, his footfall echoing in the silence. "Please," Lydia said, taking a step back. "I'm just here to help. Who are you?" The man's head tilted slowly, as if studying her. His movements were jerky, unnatural, and his presence felt wrong, like something not quite human. Lydia felt her stomach churn with dread as the figure slowly raised his hand, pointing toward the far corner of the room. When she turned to look, she saw something that froze her blood. In the corner, barely visible in the dark, was a shape. Something hunched and grotesque, its face hidden in the shadows. But the worst part was the eyes, two glowing red orbs that pierced the darkness, staring directly at her. Before Lydia could react, the door behind her slammed shut with a deafening bang, plunging the room into total darkness. Lydia's heart raced as she tried to pry open the door, but it wouldn't budge. She slammed her shoulder into it again and again, but the door remained solid, as though something, or someone, was holding it shut. She could hear the soft shuffle of footsteps behind her, too quiet to be sure of their direction. She turned around quickly, her flashlight flicking across the room. The man was gone, and the dark shape in the corner seemed to have moved closer. The red eyes were now glaring at her from only a few feet away. She stumbled backward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "No," she whispered to herself. "This can't be happening. This isn't real." The figure in the corner shifted, slowly rising to its feet, its form no longer hidden in the shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, gangly limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its face, if it could be called that, was a mess of twisted features, its skin pale and stretched tight over its skull. And those eyes, those glowing red eyes, seemed to pierce straight through her, filling her with an overwhelming sense of dread. Lydia backed away, her mind racing for a way out. But the air felt thick, heavy, like the very room was closing in on her. She could hear soft whispers, too quiet to make out, but they seemed to come from everywhere. The walls, the floor, the very air around her. Desperation surged through her as she reached for her radio, but it was too late. The figure lunged forward with a speed that was impossible, its hand outstretched. Lydia tried to raise her weapon, but the figure was too fast. It was upon her in an instant, and everything went dark. When Lydia awoke, she was back at the police station. But something was wrong. The walls were cracked, the ceiling was caving in, and there was an eerie silence hanging in the air. Her body ached and her head throbbed as if she had been struck with immense force. She stood up slowly, taking in her surroundings. The dim light flickered above her, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. There were no windows, no doors, and everything seemed off-kilter. like she was trapped in some kind of nightmare. The air was thick with an oppressive, suffocating energy. Lydia's breath caught in her throat as she heard a voice, faint and distant, calling out her name. "Lydia?" The voice was distorted, whispering from the farthest corners of the room. It was the same voice she had heard on the phone earlier. "Lydia?" The voice called again, louder this time. Lydia's heart pounded as she turned to face the source of the voice. There, standing in the doorway, was the man from the cabin, the one who had led her into the darkness. But this time, his face was clearer. The twisted features, the hollow eyes, the grotesque smile. It was all too much for her mind to process. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure said, his voice a rasping whisper. "You can't leave now." The walls seemed to close in, and Lydia could feel the air grow colder, heavier. She tried to move, but her body refused to respond. The whispers grew louder, surrounding her, suffocating her. And in that moment, she realized the horrible truth. The cabin, the phone call, the eerie fog, it had all been part of something much darker. A force beyond her understanding had lured her in, and now there was no escape. The last thing Lydia heard was the voice, one final whisper, as the darkness overtook her. "Welcome home,